Hey, this is John Leon Guerrero. Today we continue our celebration of Veterans Week, and we're honored to have as our guest Bing West. He was an infantry officer in the Marine Corps where he conducted over 100 combat patrols between 1966 and 68 and served with a combined action platoon that fought for 485 days in a remote village. He went on to write the training manual Small Unit Action in Vietnam about close combat, and The Village, which chronicled the daily lives of 15 Marines who protected Vietnamese villagers by living among them. The book became a classic of practical counterinsurgency and has been on the Marine Corps Commandant's required reading list for 5 decades. He went on to serve as Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs, during which time he made 16 extended trips to Iraq and 6 to Afghanistan. And he chaired the United States Security Commissions with El Salvador, Morocco, Tunisia, Egypt, Israel, Jordan, Pakistan, South Korea, and Japan. He's received the Department of Defense Distinguished Public Service Medal and the Department of the Navy Distinguished Civilian Service Medal, among many other awards. He's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and earned a bachelor's degree from Georgetown and a master's degree from Princeton, where he was a Woodrow Wilson Fellow. He's written 10 books, most recently 1 Million Steps, A Marine Platoon at War. He's a frequent guest on C-SPAN and the NewsHour on PBS. He's a New York Times best-selling author and a distinguished public servant for which we are ever grateful. And we are honored, proud, and excited to bring you our guest today on the Break It Down show, Bing West.
Lions Rock Productions.
This is Jay Moore.
This is Greg Cruz.
This is Bryce Vine.
This is Dexter from The Offspring.
This is Nathan
This is Sebastian Younger.
This is Daryl.
This is Stuart Copeland.
This is Mick Gillette.
This is Andy Summit.
This is Dr. Bob Greenberg.
This is Gabby Reese.
This is Rob Bell.
Hey, this is John Leon Guerrero.
Hey, and this is Pete A. Turner.
Hi, my name is Bing West. I've written several books. My most recent book is entitled 1 Million Steps, A Marine Platoon at War in Afghanistan. And I'm speaking to you on the Break It Down show.
And now, the Break It Down show with John Leon Guerrero and Pete A. Turner.
Yeah, we got Bing West. I also got best-selling author, 2 authors. What the heck am I doing? I got to write me a book. I got Scott Huesing sitting next to me.
Well, Pete, if you want to write a book, all you have to do is, just spend, how long would you say, Pete, 2 years?
Oh, Scott?
Yeah, I don't know. But what was funny was before we did the intro, the bumper of the show, is Pete says, "Hey, Bing, we can hear you typing." And I'm thinking, that guy is a true writer. Like, he never stops writing. He's written 10 books. And it just, I don't know. You know, when people ask me how long it takes you to write my first book, and the only one I have out this year, but was 12 years to tell that story. But yeah, like a year, soup to nuts, and then you go through the editing and stuff. But, I'll start off by saying is like, I'm very grateful to Bing, because when I finished my draft manuscript, which was a pretty polished product, and it still was rough in spots, I sent it to Bing, and I think he read it over the weekend, and then he emails me right back, and he says, "Hey, Scott, this is great. We got to get this published." And he sent it to his guys at Random House. They ultimately passed, but it was one of those things. This is another connection that I always talk about with fellow Marines, fellow veterans supporting other Marines. And Bing and I have never met face to face, but we're like pen pals for a couple years now, Bing, and we send emails and we share each other's info and help other vets out. And I'm extremely grateful for all of Bing's support and, integral part of my success with my first book. And his name's on the back cover of my book. He gave me a great endorsement. So again, just amazing network of Marines and people that love helping vets.
Well, your book about Ramadi was terrific, and it was so realistic. I could just feel the heat again. I mean, it's just so exhausting. And then having Jim Livingston, do the intro for you. He's always been one of my heroes, and I've never met him.
Well, I'm glad to join the club of the people that have not met each other. Although Scott and I are sitting across from each other in the cat's room in my house. You also wrote No True Glory. You wrote about the Battle of Fallujah. And I guess let's start there. When you have as much in-depth personal knowledge of the Battle of Fallujah, and then you read Scott's book about Ramadi, it's easy to think those are two of the same things, but we all know that that's not it. Let's help the audience understand, fellas, what the difference is in those fights, because they are dramatically different.
Well, the Fallujah fight was the major mistake of the Iraq War, in that I was there. Jim Mattis, who's now the Secretary of Defense, he was the division commander at the time, and this was in April of 2004, and 4 American contractors were killed, and then their bodies were burned, and they were lynched from the bridge. And President Bush immediately said, "You must attack." And all the high command said, "You must attack." And General Mattis said, wait, there are 300,000 people in that city. I know how to get the perpetrators of this action because they were foolish enough to be on camera. Let me take care of it with our special operations guys. And President Bush came back and said, "No, you must attack." So about 3,000 Marines attacked a city of 300,000. And on the third day, we were halfway across the city. We had the momentum, and the president and the high command lost their nerve. And they felt that the publicity about the attack was more than they could endure, and they ordered us to pull out. The city was turned over to the insurgents. And the key insurgent was a fellow by the name of Zarqawi, who began the ISIS movement. He was Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and we had him trapped in Fallujah and knew where he was, and we had to let him go. I mean, it was so frustrating. We could have changed the course of the war if Jim Mattis had been allowed to finish that first battle.
The regular narrative about the war is that we came in, decapitated, and then didn't bring in the army. But you're saying something different, that we had a chance to circumvent the ultimate, I guess you would call it, civil war that happened if we would have had some resolve and stuck to it. Is that...
That's exactly correct. The first mistake.
How you like that, Scott?
If you believe we had to attack Iraq, and I believe we did, given the intelligence that they had chemical and possibly nuclear weapons. That turned out to be wrong, but you make intelligence mistakes. Once we attacked, the military, including General Mattis, believed that we were going to take the Iraqi army, get rid of the bad apples in it, and basically use them as a governing force until everything was sorted out. But it turned out that the civilian leadership in the White House and other places decided to disband the entire army, which left us holding the bag. And then when we were making strides, this is when Al-Qaeda in Iraq, under Zarqawi, beheaded that poor kid. People forget this, but a fellow by the name of Peter Berg, was beheaded on television in April of 2004. And if we could have finished the fight and done away with Al-Qaeda in Iraq because we had them trapped then, it would have changed the war. But we lost our nerve.
Yeah, I think that that's a common trend, whether you're talking about the Battle of Fallujah or Ramadi is, and I'll get Bing's opinion on this, because I often say that, whether it's, the analogy is this big game of whack-a-mole we were playing in the country from the initial invasion to, 03, 04, 06 when I was in the Second Battle of Ramadi. But we were hammering down on these pockets of resistance, and then we would let up on this pressure, and it allowed them to slip away, and then they'd pop back up in these other cities. And regardless of the city, there was, again, my theory is this sine wave of fighting where it goes really, really bad, not so bad, really, really bad. And then there's this median point that we never really found. And, we talk about these battles, Fallujah 1, Fallujah 2, Ramadi 1, Ramadi 2. But in essence, I have a theory that these are like 2-year-long battles. And it's through our own, I will say, failures that we didn't apply sustained, steady pressure on these cities to really clean them out, because we have such an aversion to being viewed as occupiers and not really coming to that culminating point, that finishing point where we have satisfaction, where we establish the Iraqi army in a place where it needs to be, and continually, when we think that the Iraqi army or the Iraqi government is capable of sustaining itself, they've just got a massive proven track record of ineptitude and failure in certain regards. And that's why we continue to see ourselves still back there. And as you heard me speak, at the Nixon Library this week, I'm talking about 9/11, and 17 years later, we're still fighting this war. And Bing can relate to this as a Vietnam vet. What I mean, it's crazy to think about that, isn't that, Bing?
Well, I spent 4 years fighting in Vietnam, and I've made over 30 trips in the last 17 years to Iraq and Afghanistan. I mean, that gives you an idea of the difference. Look, when I look back, and I'm going to write an article about this that is not going to make me popular with the generals, but there were two colossal mistakes made in both Iraq and Afghanistan. The first, on the political side, was a belief, starting with President Bush and continuing on, that we had a religious evangelical obligation to give freedom to other countries. I think then, and at the time, I thought that was crazy. Now I still think it's crazy. I wrote a book called The Wrong War about Afghanistan. The idea that we were going to go into the Middle East and make Democrats out of them with a small d is nuts. And that was a political mistake. And for that, I really blame President Bush more than I do President Obama, but both of them were culpable of that. But the generals, I'm really more angry at, because the generals had the obligation of understanding how to fight. And I was flabbergasted. I wrote a book called The Village about my combined action platoon of Marines and Vietnamese farmers for 3 years in Vietnam. And I understood counterinsurgency. And I watched General Petraeus and these other generals coming up with this hogwash about troops 19 years of age being nation builders. And all those generals became famous and went on to great careers, and they lost. They lost because they had a doctrine that was incorrect, and their egos were so large that they never admitted their mistake. Do you know, to today, the Marines and the Army have not changed their field manual that says the Marines and soldiers are nation builders as well as warriors. And that is plain wrong. And that is an obligation of the generals to admit they made a colossal mistake, but they won't. We've had 17 generals in 17 years in Afghanistan, and every single one of them has said we're on the verge of victory.
We keep turning the corner.
That's culpable negligence. But they all get promoted to 4 stars. They go on boards. Everyone says they're wonderful. The American people love them. I mean, I think it's crazy. They didn't do a good job.
I think that's so spot on. I read The Village, and it has. I also read another great book by a friend of mine who's a Green Beret called Game Changers by Scott Mann, where he talks about how we applied those lessons in Vietnam about staying in the community, staying in the villages, that foreign internal defense concept, and really making it work, and again seeing it to fruition. I always say that we never had a definition of what winning was, from a political standpoint. And I don't care about politics or policy or strategy. We were fighting the enemy. And you've been embedded as a reporter, as a journalist. You've been a war fighter in Vietnam. So you understand we're not fighting policies. We're fighting the enemy, people that are daily trying to kill us. So at the end of the day, people always ask me that question, well, what is winning? Well, we rely on those senior level decision makers, and we never have that end game. We never have, what that metric of success was. What do you think the metric was, Bing?
Well, I think the metric should have been very simple, that we left a government in Iraq and Afghanistan that was capable of governing with some basic principles, but capable of taking care of the terrorists, so we don't have to do it all the time. We failed there, and I believe that, again, was an enormous defect in our generals, and I talked to them at length about this, and also in our presidents in the White House, because we chose, consider this, in both Iraq and Afghanistan, we said that we will help you. We'll go out and fight and die for you, but we will not select who your commanders are or who your president is. We'll leave all that up to you. So we ended up with a bunch of punk, corrupt people all the way to the top. And we became their servants. We ended up with a guy by the name of Maliki, who was a malign, sectarian, pro-Iranian as the prime minister. I mean, wow for us. And Maliki hates us and is doing everything he can in Iraq today to ensure that Iran uses Iraq as a satrap. And President Bush used to talk to Maliki every week, president to president. It used to turn my stomach. And then in Afghanistan, we selected as a president a guy by the name of Karzai, who despises us and scoffs us and does everything he can to claim that the Americans are a bunch of stooges. Those are the people, Maliki and Karzai, that we put in charge of countries. Shame on us.
We've had General Dan Bolger on the show, and he holds the generals liable, and he's a 3-star. And he talked about, and actually, it turns out he had been in the same area as me for a little while when I was going out on patrols. When we get to the tactical part of things, right? Like, and this is what I was able to give generals when I was in Iraq and Afghanistan. This is the ground truth. So we had this idea, this model that we were going to teach and train the local forces, whether it's police, the government officials, the army people from Iraq or Afghanistan. But the reality is when you got to the soldier on the ground, I could talk to those guys, like the Sons of Iraq, like towards the end of that, like, are these guys going to be a body for good or for bad or what? And it's like, no, they're irrelevant. They don't have any ammo. They don't feel confident. They've said openly to me that the first sign of trouble, they're going to run. They're just standing there because they're getting paid to do so, and nobody around them believed them. Their moment had passed. But that message was absolutely smashed as it went up the chain from the platoon level up to, say, division, which for the audience is pretty high. It's thousands of people gathered doing one thing. So if the people on the ground don't believe that they have the capability to do the basic things that we're teaching them, and if the people who live amongst them don't believe that their soldiers can do incredible things like give IVs, like we'd have a brigade commander getting an IV from an Iraqi soldier, and there'd be a great storyboard telling the American soldiers about it, but not a single Iraqi was ever invited to go, hey, look what your people are doing. We miss these things, these opportunities. So even if we did nation build, we never trained to be good nation builders. We have this problem of you have a multifaceted fight, right? I like to say, like, it's about 20% military. You have to start with the military part. And this is kind of coin stuff. But the way we approached it, we turned ourselves into the insurgents. So when we fought coin, we fought ourselves a lot. What do you think?
Well, I'll just come back to it again. Sure, I mean, even in Vietnam, actually, I would say Vietnam really was quite different. In Vietnam, the Vietnamese generals and the Vietnamese politicians, I believe, really had enough spirit in them that they could have defended against North Vietnam, except that we cut off their aid and we cut off the bombing. So there's a big difference I would make between what happened in Vietnam and what happened in Iraq and Afghanistan. The Vietnamese soldiers who were on our side were better soldiers than the Iraqis and the Afghan soldiers who are on our side. The Vietnamese soldiers were much better. The hierarchy was actually better in Vietnam, despite all the claims of corruption, than it was and is in Iraq and Afghanistan. The problem with building from the bottom up that we're so familiar with, Pete, is that we can do well at the, say, the platoon or level with 40 people or a company with 140 people. But then if they have to work for a battalion commander who's stealing from them, and if the battalion commander has to work for a division commander who's demanding money from the battalion commander, and if the president of the country is demanding money from all of them, then you have a system that is bound to lose. And we never changed that system. Even till today, look, we're still fighting in Afghanistan. And it's bewildering. You have to ask, what are we doing now? Well, we now say we're fighting to kill enough Taliban that they will reconcile with the central government. Now, think of that logic. We're going to kill them until they agree to talk. Well, but the fact is that out in the countryside where the small platoons are, those small Afghan platoons are scared to death of the Taliban. And as a result, as you were just indicating, Pete, that at the village level, the Taliban dominate because they're tougher, they have more resolve. And darned if I know how we can be saying every year we're on the verge of victory in Afghanistan. It baffles me.
I'll tell you right now, like we have a security bubble, like a heavy bubble of about 100 to 150 meters outside of our camp. That covers nobody in the valley in Afghanistan that you're in. And maybe a soft bubble that's out 1,000 meters because we have weapons that can reach out that far if we're able to use them, which typically we're not because it's a long way to shoot towards, civilians. And everywhere else, it's all controlled by the Taliban. And so imagine, listeners, like your county, whatever size your county is. And in your county, there is a tiny 100-meter, maybe 1,000-meter bubble that has some semblance of safety and security. Everything else is up to you and up to the bad man on the road. That's what Bing's describing. That's what it's like on the side of the country. And so when we go out and we talk to people, like I'm great at this. I'll start talking to the farmers and everything else. Like what's the last thing the government do for you? And I'm the funniest guy in the valley. I'm like, the government. Oh, listen, a guy came to my house last night to have tea and told me that I had to give him whatever provisions I had. And you don't understand, like I have no ability to say no to that. I'm not going to. And when you guys, meaning us, say that you're going to defeat the Taliban, I already know that they'll be at the table negotiating because they're from here. My people are in the Taliban. And they're going to be part of the government. So don't tell me to reject them. That's ridiculous because it's just not their reality. That's in no way a viable position. And so we become the joke of the valley, really.
Well, my latest book, 1 Million Steps, a Marine Platoon at War, I embedded with a Marine platoon in Sangin. And that was a tough place. And a great platoon commander by the name of Vic Garcia. Vic started with 52 Marines. And in the course of 7 months, he had 3 killed, 9 amputations, and 17 gunshot wounds. So he had 26 at the end. We would go out 3 and 4 kilometers, 3 and 4 clicks, just like we were supposed to. Some of the Askaris, some of the Afghan soldiers would tag along with us. But what frustrated me, and now I'm writing another novel about it, what frustrated me was that we all knew, every Marine knew, including the battalion commander and including the division commander, that once we left, the Afghan soldiers would retreat back into the center and not go out into the green zone. And sure enough, we lost Sangin. But we knew this in 2010. And yet we kept sending our kids out to get blown up. I mean, I just don't understand it. I really, it's culpable negligence.
The question is, and I know we do a lot of things right over there too at the tactical level, and we have this discussion a lot and I always say it more simplistically because I'm not as smart as Bing, but the Marines and the soldiers, we're really good at breaking stuff up and blowing stuff up, but we're really, really bad at building stuff up.
Yeah.
And when I see even top field grade officers, general level officers talking to Afghan and Iraqi officials who have the equivalency of maybe a third grade education about infrastructure and economics and rebuilding countries, it galls me. And this is coming from a guy that went to Illinois State. I'm not some guy that sits in academia and contemplates these problems, but it just makes sense. And I break it down in those simple terms because this is where I have this call to action to our senior level policymakers, our administrative officials, to come up with a solution. What is the plan to improve this? And I always use the adage, we have to show them what right looks like. And until we do that, until we're willing to commit that, I think we're going to continue to do this. And we're going to continue to repeat our mistakes because we're obviously not being good students of history. And we're talking with Bing West right now, who is probably one of the foremost experts on writing books. He's written 10 books about fighting wars, being involved in counterinsurgencies, embedding with this long war that we fought. I mean, Bing, what is this? I mean, I know it's hard to articulate sometimes, but what do our policymakers have to do?
Hey, this is Pete A. Turner, and I wanted to highlight a special veteran today. I want to introduce you to Philip Dana. Philip.
Thank you, Pete. I'm Philip Dana, Vice President of Human Resources at Bridgepoint Education here in sunny San Diego, California. I am the 20th man in my family to serve in the military, including Richard Henry Dana of Dana Point, who wrote the book 2 years before the mast about sailor and minority rights. So it's kind of cool.
Yeah.
I've created a career of helping veterans transition.
Tell us some of the things that the companies can do to nail down a good veteran hiring program.
Pete, good question. I think companies can do a lot of different things. I've been going around talking about 8 simple tips in doing those types of programs, but a couple of the big ones that got the ahas going in the audience is one, hiring veterans doesn't have to be straight out of the military. We are a highly networked group of individuals. Most of us connect with other veterans on social media. Most of us belong to alumni or American Legion or help veteran non-for-profits. We stay engaged in service, and to be able to tap that and getting director and VP level candidates that happen to be veterans is a phenomenal addition to your recruiting program. That's one. The other tip is you might be surprised what resources you already have in your organization. For example, here in San Diego, the largest vet per capita city in the United States, very veteran heavy, right? With Navy and Marine Corps. If you have 10 employees, it's very likely you have at least one vet and probably 1 to 2 spouses. And spouses are often overlooked as part of the veteran talent pool. And if you just find those folks inside your organization, ask them to help. They're not going to say no, and put them to work. You might be surprised what they come back with.
Nice. Good one. Yeah, the spouses are huge. Give us one more, then we're going to get back to the show.
Yeah, I think the third tip to companies that are thinking about hiring veterans is veterans are not homogeneous. You don't hire veterans for all leadership. Guess what? Not all veterans lead. And believe me, not all veterans are good at it. And so I love all the rhetoric, and I love all the momentum and all the verbiage that you hear and see in articles about hiring veterans, but I wouldn't hire all veterans the same. You're not going to put a Navy nuke in the same job you would a Marine Special Forces leader, for example. Different cultures. Focus on the culture, focus on the values and the competencies that align, and find the match inside of the veteran talent pool. Don't treat them all the same.
How do folks find you on social media so they can maybe bring some questions to you and talk to you about what you do?
Well, my name is Philip Dana with 1 L, and I am easily found on LinkedIn or Twitter. LinkedIn is my favorite battleground.
All right. I love it. Your favorite battleground. Cool. Thanks, man.
We're talking with Bing West right now, who is probably one of the foremost experts on writing books. He's written 10 books about fighting wars, being involved in counterinsurgencies, embedding with this long war that we fought. I mean, being what is this? I mean, I know it's hard to articulate sometimes, but what do our policymakers have to do?
They have to have humility. And it has been my experience. I was the Assistant Secretary for International Security Affairs. I used to meet with the presidents, etc. What we're seeing in the Catholic Church, and I'm a Catholic, now is turbulence at the top among the cardinals when they're beginning to recognize that in many ways they turned blind eye to things they didn't want to hear about with the sex scandals. And I put in the same category cardinals, senators, people working in the White House, and assistant secretaries and above in the Pentagon, and four-star generals. And that is, you get to a certain level in life and you're in a bubble where your aides all admire you tremendously. You're talking to your peers, and after a while, you think you really know more than you really do know. And you become disconnected, and you think that, by gosh, I'm really smart. And that causes you to never admit failures, never admit when you made mistakes. And we're seeing that in the Catholic Church. And sooner or later, we're going to see it inside our own military with people being fed up. But what happened, right, we started with the idea of a war on terrorism. Well, who are the terrorists? Well, the terrorists are radical Islamists, but they're in many countries. So why do we have to be in Afghanistan fighting all this way? If all you have to do is sort of say, look, I'm not going to give any more visas to people coming from Afghanistan. I don't give visas to people coming from Somalia. You don't have to be chasing wild Muhammad all the time in order to protect us. And you can cut down dramatically on our costs. The reason that, in my judgment, that Afghanistan could never be brought into a democratic nation was very, very simple. It's money. This new novel I have coming out deals with the fact that Helmand Province, where all the Marines were, between 500 million and 1 billion American dollars go into that small province at the bottom of Afghanistan every single year to buy the poppy, which becomes the heroin, which supplies the heroin throughout the world. You have a network of buyers, Iranian buyers, Pakistani buyers, and some Afghan buyers who come in and they tell 200,000 farmers, I will pay you 4 times what you can make from wheat or corn if you will grow poppy. And as a result, you have a system of absolute corruption that you cannot break by going in there and saying, I'm going to show you a different way of making watermelons. You have to, at some particular point, stand back and say, there is a corruption so endemic in this system that I am not going to have my Marines dying in a province that will never become democratic. I will find another way of fighting this war. I will stand off. I'll smash the hell out of people when I have the opportunity. I won't allow Pakistan to get away with having a sanctuary all the time. But I will fight a war that is simply wearing the other side down and nothing more than that. And that's what I would basically do, which would be entirely different. But $1 billion a year being given to these farmers, those farmers are never going to become Democrats.
So who is our last great white hope? Is it Jim Mattis? Is it this guy who's been at every level that you know personally? I mean, you're probably with him when you wrote the March Up with 3rd Battalion, 4th Marines. And
I also finished Jim Mattis and I have another book that we finished, and we're just waiting for him to, when he's finished his tour, we're going to publish that book.
So is he our hope?
Tommy?
Is Jim Mattis our last great white hope? Is he the one that's going to bring it home?
I was going to say, don't put anything on any one person. You have to look at this as a system. You have to basically stand back a little bit. But one thing I will say, It's not the Secretary of Defense ever. It's always the president. When you stand back, the one person who really can make dramatic changes one way or the other is the president, and everything flows from him as the commander-in-chief. And you see substantial differences between President Bush, President Obama, and President Trump. But if you get back to the heart of the matter again and say, what is our objective? Our objective is to keep ourselves safe against Islamic terrorists. That's our objective. Everything else is secondary. And we're doing a darn good job. I just worry that we're spending entirely too much money, and we could do it much cheaper. But we also, for preparing for future battles, have to have a system that is willing, and this is a military system, that is willing to admit when they've done something wrong, so they learn. And what worries me, we're now talking about cyber war and getting ready for the Russians or the Chinese, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
But if those same people are not willing to sort of say, our doctrine for Iraq and Afghanistan was wrong, then I worry. And that far transcends any one individual. It's a system that has to be more honest about itself.
Yeah, we're operating off the best doctrine 1980 had to offer. We have never caught up with that. And we have these patches and plug-and-play systems where, we'll develop a training program, which is addressing the problems at hand. But you're right, Bing. Systematically, doctrinally, we are in the dark. We do not have a system or an organization that is really revamping how we think as a military. Instead, we're just putting Band-Aids on all these problems. And we've seen this over the last 10 years, 15, 17 years now, with everything we're doing in the Horn of Africa, Iraq, Afghanistan, you name it.
We've proven to not be very good at creating stability, because there's rules to stability operations. Like, really, in an unstable place, instability is the norm. And it's elastic.
Correct. And why get involved when we don't have to get involved?
They're better at instability than us.
We have to be crusaders. I don't believe we have to be nation builders.
So, okay, we've covered a lot of this ground, and it frustrates me. It'll get me going, and I want to complain about a bunch of things. But I want to ask you a different question, because we've talked a lot about the presidents and the policymakers, and there's a lot of heat that's thrown at the illegal war in Iraq and everything else. But no shit, if Bing West is president on 9/11/2001, what the heck do you do? I mean, who had a better plan? Like, nobody was like, I've been waiting for this. Let me show you my op order. It's really simple. Okay.
Not quite. Not quite there, Pete. The fact is that the military was very, very slow off the mark in 9/11. But I'm not a big General Franks advocate, and he was the commander of our forces at the time. And we had an opportunity to finish Al-Qaeda. We had them trapped in the Tora Bora Mountains in November of 2001. And we had, ironically, it was Mattis, the same guy who's now the Secretary of Defense, was a brigadier general with 5,000 Marines in southern Afghanistan. He had moved them all in there. And there are a lot of rumors that the Army was very jealous that there were all these Marines that suddenly had popped up. And Mattis basically offered his entire brigade to go into the Tora Bora Mountains and cut off the mountain passes going into Pakistan, block the rear, and destroy Al-Qaeda. And General Franks refused. He said, I'm going to do this with the local tribes. And the director of the CIA for the operation went to President Bush, and he said to President Bush, he said, sir, we have these Marines, we have Rangers. I recommend we put them in and stop this, stop the passes, not use the locals. And President Bush, Mr. Rumsfeld later said, was unwilling to get involved in a military argument against his own General Franks. And as a result, we allowed Al-Qaeda to escape and Osama bin Laden to escape. We could have finished that fight in the first year if we had used our own forces. That was a strategic mistake of the first order.
So when we have our Lake Trasimene moment and we've got the army pinned against the lake and it's dusk and we're about to start reaping, you're saying that we, instead of finishing the job, we keep letting the door open. We did it in Fallujah. We did it in Tora Bora. And that's just, we didn't have the general at the right time with that killer instinct who had the authority to get the job done.
That is correct. With one exception, I will say, and they're quite right about the man. General Petraeus is an intellectual guy. I don't know what General Franks was, but Mattis is a different cat. When General Mattis is on a battlefield, and by the way, General Dunford, when Dunford was a colonel, he had the same instinct. They're Wolverines. As far as they're concerned, and Mattis has said it bluntly since he's been Secretary of Defense, you fight to annihilate, to kill all. You don't leave them alive. You don't give them a second chance. I firmly believe if they had allowed Mattis to be Mattis at that moment in Afghanistan, he would have finished al-Qaeda. He wasn't going to play any games with them. And the same thing was true in Fallujah. We're halfway across the city and we're clawed out. We lose our will at certain points because people don't recognize that if you go to war, the objective of war is to destroy and to kill the enemy until the enemy comes to your terms or you've annihilated him. You can't come to terms with the Islamist radical terrorists. You just have to annihilate them. And you need generals who understand that. I'm going out, I'm going to annihilate them. And that's what actually, and I have to give some credit here now to what's happened. In the last 2 years, as I understand it from the outside, President Trump just turned to the military, turned to Dunford, turned to Mattis and said, well, you guys are telling me you want to fight a different war with really relaxed rules of engagement. Well, go ahead. And look what they've done. We don't know what's happening on those battlefields because there aren't reporters out there. But by gosh, they really took it to the other side. And that means you're going to have civilian casualties as well. But you have to expect that if you're going to go to war.
My portrait of Bill Sherman on the wall over there is nodding yes. Because he's like, I said this. I told you guys 150 years ago.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. Sherman did. Sherman said, don't. And Sherman and Grant broke the will of the South, the moral will of the South. And you have to understand what you're doing when you go to war. And I don't think I think President Bush was entirely too nice. So was President Obama. They were just genuinely nice guys who didn't grasp the nettle of what it was. And they had a chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Admiral Mullen. Admiral Mullen knew nothing about warfare. He never fired a shot in anger. And you had Admiral Mullen bringing in this kid who had written 3 cups of tea or something about how you make friends with the tribes and trusting Pakistan. We were entirely at the top, too naive. If you go to war, go to kill.
Bing, as you went back, I'll kind of, we're still talking about, writing and warfare, but one of the questions I've never asked you is, having been at the ground level as a young warfighter in Vietnam, and then moving up the ranks, and working in the government alongside some senior policymakers, and then transitioning as a journalist and as an author, and then going back as an embedded reporter to capture these stories of this new war that we're fighting. What was that like, being back in that environment, not having a rifle with you, and being able to tell and share the stories of the young men and women who are fighting this war? What's that like?
The 2 largest changes that I saw, and hey, I'm 78 years of age. I'm the only one. I hate to say this, but Mattis and friends like that, they're 68. They were never in Vietnam. So I think I'm probably the only one that's been back on the battlefields that actually was in a war prior that was quite different. So the 2 huge differences that I've seen is, first, the attitude toward death. I was in a firefight once in 1966, and we're out there, and we were hit, tough fight during the day. Then our battalion commander, who was an idiot, put us into a palm grove at night, and we were hit by the North Vietnamese with mortars, and you could hear screaming, etc. And we were trying to shut kids up when they were crying too much, because then they would know where you were. And in the morning, they came by me, some of my troops, and they were carrying two Marines that had been killed in ponchos. I said, "Who are they?" And they said, "Oh, sir, it's, I don't know, something like Sullivan and Garcia or something." I said, "I don't know them. What are you talking about?" They said, "Oh, no, sir, they just joined us last night." So you were, and then we were gone. An hour later, I had the troops on the move. So death was accepted as something that is just there with you, and that's it, and you move. Death today is almost, I have to be careful with my words, but we have to be careful it doesn't become a coronation. When someone now is killed that I saw in Iraq or Afghanistan, the entire unit would stand down for a day, and there would be a ceremony. And then there would be a ceremony when the body was placed on the coffin on the plane. Then there'd be a ceremony when they were received at Dover, Delaware. Then there'd be a ceremony at the gravesite. There'd be 4 or 5 funerals for the same person. But that gradually saps you. It gives you a different notion as to what death is. It gives you a different idea of, well, you don't really die when you go to war. And so I am concerned, you get back into another big war, you get back into something even like Vietnam, where you'd lose 200 in a day, 200 the next day, 200 the next day. Whoa, we have inculcated in our officers, in our staff NCOs, in our entire system, the idea you don't die in war. And I think that really worries me. The other thing, and I'll just bluntly say it, is at my old age, look, mixing the sexes to the degree that we're doing has not been tested in a war. And I'll just leave it there, but I've heard too many stories from too many people about you can't, there is such a thing as physical attraction and emotional attraction. And you say, well, everyone gets along as one team. Well, I'm an old General Barrow kind of guy. On my battlefields, when it really is raw, I don't want people being emotionally attached or physically attached. I'm a little bit concerned too that we're going too far with mixing the genders. You can see why I'm 78. Hey,
Bing, I'm the president of the 2-4 Association, which is rife with Vietnam vets. I'm honored to be able to lead that organization. I just wrote an article praising the first female infantry officer, First Lieutenant Marina Hurl, who is a platoon commander in Echo Company, 2nd Battalion, 4th Marines, forward deployed in Darwin, Australia. And before I published that article, I emailed or Facebooked the company commander and the battalion commander. I said, answer one question. Is she crushing it? And one word, yes. And, it's interesting because, and I'm not saying this, with any disrespect, to, your age and wisdom, but I think when you reach a certain point, and I hope I try and evolve with changing times, is we as Marines have to look back on our own history and how we became so great. And I think it's because of our diversification and our willingness to change and adapt and understand that, hey, this is happening. And the people at those senior levels, especially within our corps, are making these decisions not based off of political or societal pressures, but because this may be the right thing to do. And the argument I always make is like, yeah, you could have attraction towards a female who you work with, but we also have open gays in the military now. So you could have 2 guys that are attracted to each other, and we've accepted that. And that is a big pill to swallow. I get it. But,
Scott, I hear you entirely. And my son, Owen, who now is in charge of the Special Forces, Assistant Secretary, when he was running the 500 mile races, they had these teams, and he was on the Nike team, and they had a woman. Every team has to have one woman, and she was better than 99 out of every 100 men. So you can have the exceptions, like the one infantry officer that you're talking about. I'm certain she can probably do 200 push-ups and is super in every way. I have no objections to that. I didn't mean that. I'm not worried about the infantry itself because the women aren't going to go in the infantry, period. That is, Canada for 10 years has had an open policy, and they have less than 2%, it might be less than 1% of the infantry are women, because women, to a large extent, don't want to be in the infantry. Don't fine. So I'm not worried about the infantry. I meant something much, much more broad than that. Look, ships now are 20% women, right? 20%. When you get up to those levels, that is different than any historical case we have ever seen. Never have we fought a war under those conditions. And if we do, then we're going to find out. I could be wrong. It could be that really the differences in the sexes really don't show up. But you have to admit that we're taking a gamble that no other nation has ever taken, including Israel. You know, Israel stopped doing it about 5 years ago. Israel no longer integrates that way. So we have a Navy that cannot fight without the women at the battle stations in a large number, not a small number. And maybe it's all going to work out. You know, we're going to find out someday, because I do believe there will be another major war. There always is.
Yeah, there always is, and it's hard to know. I saw a picture the other day of a Russian, who knows if it was real or not, but it was a Russian tank being airdropped, into a battle zone. Everybody's like, look at what they're doing. They're bringing tanks in from the sky. And they're like, oh, come on. This is silly. But you're right. At some point, there's going to be some kind of big state-on-state fight, and no matter what state it is, most everybody's not going to be prepared for that. And it seems like all of us old military guys are always complaining about, like, the Navy's no good. The Navy guys, we don't got enough boats. We don't have the right kind of boats. There's too many boats. We're always unsatisfied with where we're at. Our doctrine's too focused on being nice. Our doctrine's not lethal enough. We're doing all these things. It's a complex thing trying to predict the future. I see a lot of things on drones, right? Like, look at this is how we're going to deploy drones. How's Muhammad going to deploy a drone? We're going to have electronic warfare measures. So he's just going to fly it straight in, pre-programmed, without any kind of radio control. And right now, I say this all the time, Bing. Right now, I can go on Amazon and buy a drone that will deliver a 100-pound payload wherever I tell it to. That is a problem. Like, war has been democratized in a lot of ways. You can really pick your targets. And maybe you don't have to have a big strategic win, but you sure as heck can create a lot of problems for somebody that you want to have problems.
Well, let me conclude by just this way, guys. I appreciate being on with you, but my view of the next war, and who knows, we've never predicted the right war. Okay, we didn't predict World War II. We didn't predict Korea. We didn't predict what happened in Vietnam. We didn't predict Desert Storm. We didn't predict 9/11. We didn't predict Iraq. We didn't predict Afghanistan. Let me take it off to a huge tangent. I don't understand if right now the new military strategy is to be prepared for your competitors who are at your own level, say Russia or China. They're the biggest, and maybe in third place Iran, but really Russia or China. Now, what really puzzles me, we know enough. We're talking over digital, and I'm looking at you, Pete, as we talk. The whole internet, the whole concept of cyberspace has no boundary between the military and the civilian. My hypothesis about the next war is there are going to be battles, but the big battle is going to come when both sides, both the corporations, the civilian hackers, the military, et cetera, all get involved one way or the other, because you're not going to be able to stop it. And all of a sudden, the stock market stops, international trade stops, electricity is cut off on, and you're going to have a question: which nation has the guts to stick it out rather than reach an agreement that's better for the other side? And it's going to test the national will of Russia, the national will of China, and the national will of America. It's going to become a truly world war that involves the civilians in a way we've never thought of before. Not that they're dying, but their entire material way of living will be affected.
And the
Is that your next novel? Did you just give us a sneak peek?
The Viva la Resistance.
Yeah.
Hey, I want to end on this. We got the Red Sox absolutely crushing it, and I'm assuming by your locality and slight accent that you are for the Red Sox.
Well, you are a very discerning person, Pete. I really like how you get finally to the heart of the matter.
Yeah. The heart.
I love it.
But we can't just limit it to we just can't limit it to where we're going with the Sox. I mean, a lot depends on look, people like J.D. Martinez and Porcello and Pedroia and Kimbrough. I think. Going all the way to the World Series, I noticed the Wall Street Journal says we're 51% favorites, meaning the other teams at the top are so good that the playoffs are going to be terrific and you can't predict. But then we have this other team, with Guy Benet, Brady, and a couple of Gronkowski and a few others. It looks like the odds of them getting to the next Super Bowl are maybe 60 or 70%. So parking the cars in Harvard Yard will be a problem, I think, for some time to come.
Hey, Bing, thank you so much. And seriously, anytime you want to come on, you want to talk about a book, or you want to yell at me and call me stupid, and tell me, you got it all wrong, you're absolutely allowed to come on and encourage.
Hey, Pete, I appreciate it. And Scott, I appreciate it. Scott, are you working on another novel? A novel? What are you doing?
I am working on a second book right now, in between writing a lot of op-eds, but I'm also working on a full-length featured documentary, which Pete's actually helping me on.
Yeah.
And it's going to be really A-list. I got some great support from a good friend of mine up in Hollywood who is going to be the executive producer. So, yeah, I'm staying at it, man.
Let me just observe that the money, you may not care about money, but once you have kids and grandkids and college educations, et cetera, but the money stream for video is 30 times that of writing. I mean, There's that much difference. The only problem is that, they're a closed guild in LA. You have to go out there and hang around with them out there. They really face-to-face stuff with them counts for an awful lot, but God bless you. And I think that's the way to go. Go video.
Yeah.
But then go out there and kind of hobnob with them a little bit, beat them up occasionally just so they know they're dealing with a tough Marine.
Well, I asked you this, about following in your footsteps, and I would be, a tenth of the guy if I could to be embedded and tell great military stories. That's what I love to do. And, I'll tell one quick funny story. When I pitched Bing my manuscript and then I got my contract, I called Bing. I said, man, I don't know what I'm doing, Bing. I said, I got to read through this contract. And I said, I said, hey, they're only offering me 20 free books. Does that sound right? And I'm thinking I'm going to get 500 free books. And you know what Bing says? He says, well, hey, Scotty, they must really like you because Random House only gives me 5 or something like that. So you have been a real inspiration to me. And I tell you, I'm super grateful to know you and call you my friend. And next time I'm in Boston, we got to get together for sure.
Yeah, you give me a yell down here in Newport. But definitely, guys, if you're going to get into the video world, you have to get out there and spend some time with them face to face.
You got it. That's what we'll do. Hey, Bing West, everybody.